I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, sharing a room with my stepson, Ethan. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, but life has a way of throwing unexpected twists at you when you least expect them. It all started when my husband, David, got a sudden job opportunity in another city. The offer was too good to refuse, and within days he was packing his bags, leaving me and Ethan behind. It was meant to be temporary, a few weeks at most, but those weeks turned into months. And with our home undergoing renovations, space was tight. That's how I ended up sharing a room with Ethan, a quiet and reserved 18-year-old who had never really warmed up to me since I married his father. At first, we barely spoke. Our conversations were limited to polite exchanges, and I could tell he wasn't thrilled about the situation. But something changed one night when a heavy storm rolled in. The power flickered, the wind howled against the windows, and for the first time, Ethan looked genuinely uneasy. It was in that moment that our carefully maintained distance began to break. I didn't expect what happened next. As the storm raged outside, I saw a different side of Ethan, one I had never seen before, a side that made me question everything I thought I knew about him. But was it just the storm, or was something deeper at play? Stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. Ethan sat stiffly on his bed, his gaze fixed on the dim light of his phone screen. The storm outside was relentless. Thunder rolled through the sky, rattling the windows, and the wind howled like a restless spirit. I could feel the tension in the air, but it wasn't just the storm. It was the weight of the unspoken words between us, the invisible wall we had built since the day I became his stepmother. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and glanced at him. He looked calm on the surface, but his fingers were clenched around his phone just a little too tightly. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice softer than I expected. Ethan hesitated. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, but his tone lacked conviction. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the house, and in the same moment, the power cut out completely. The room was swallowed in darkness, and I heard Ethan suck in a sharp breath. "Hold on," I murmured, fumbling for my phone to turn on the flashlight. The dim glow cast long shadows on the walls, flickering with every bolt of lightning that streaked across the sky. Ethan was unusually quiet. When I looked at him again, his posture had changed, shoulders tense, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting something. "Ethan?" I prompted. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I hate storms," he admitted under his breath, as if saying it out loud made him vulnerable. It was the first real thing he had ever shared with me. I hesitated for a moment, then said, "You don't have to sit through it alone." For the first time that night, he met my gaze. There was something in his expression, something guarded but fragile, like he was wrestling with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the storm that had shaken him. Something else was haunting Ethan, and I needed to find out what it was. Ethan's confession hung between us, swallowed by the steady rhythm of rain against the window. I wanted to ask more, to press him on what exactly made storms so unbearable for him, but something in his expression warned me against it. His usual guarded demeanor was cracked just enough for me to see a glimpse of the emotions he fought to keep buried. I leaned back against the headboard, keeping my voice light. "You know, when I was a kid, I used to be terrified of storms too." Ethan scoffed under his breath. "Yeah?" I nodded, watching his silhouette in the dim glow of my phone's flashlight. "My mum used to tell me stories to distract me, said if I listened closely I could hear patterns in the thunder, like a secret message from the sky. For a second, I thought he might ignore me, but then he let out a slow breath and shook his head. "That sounds nice." His voice was quieter now, more distant. Silence stretched between us before I spoke again. "What is it about storms that gets to you?" Ethan hesitated. I saw his jaw tighten, like he was debating whether to let me in or shut me out again. Finally, he muttered, "It's stupid." "I doubt that." He glanced at me, then away. "When I was younger, my mum, He stopped, exhaling sharply. She left during a storm, just walked out the door and never came back. My heart clenched. I had known Ethan's mother abandoned him and David years ago, but I had no idea it happened like that. No wonder he reacted this way. Before I could respond, a sudden knock echoed from the hallway. We both froze. It was nearly midnight. Who would be at our door at this hour? Ethan's expression shifted instantly, from troubled to something much darker. He knew something I didn't. And judging by the tension in his face, whatever it wasn't good. The knock came again, louder this time, a sharp, deliberate sound that cut through the silence like a blade. Ethan sat rigid on his bed, his breathing shallow. The glow from my phone flashlight flickered against the walls, casting shadows that felt like they were closing in. I swallowed, my throat dry. Who would be here this late? Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the door, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. A chill ran down my spine. Something about this wasn't right. I swung my legs off the bed, my bare feet meeting the cold floor. I hesitated for just a second before moving toward the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. But before I could reach for the handle, Ethan shot up and grabbed my wrist. "Don't!" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the urgency in it sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I turned to him, my pulse racing. "Ethan, what's going on?" His jaw tightened. "I don't know," he said, but I could tell he was lying. He knew something, and whatever it was, he didn't want me opening that door. Another knock, this time slower. A deliberate pause between each one, as if whoever was on the other side wanted us to feel their presence. I felt my skin prickle. "Ethan, if you know something, you need to tell me." Before I could finish, my phone buzzed in my hand. A text from an unknown number. "Don't open the door." I felt the blood drain from my face. My fingers trembled as I turned the screen toward Ethan. His eyes widened just slightly, just enough to confirm what I already suspected. This wasn't random. Someone knew we were here, someone was watching us, and they didn't want us answering that door. The knock stopped. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever was outside, they weren't alone. I didn't move, neither did Ethan. We both stared at the door, barely breathing, as the silence stretched on. Then another creak. Closer this time. Someone was inside the house. Ethan's grip on my wrist tightened. His face was pale, his breathing shallow. "We need to stay quiet," he whispered, barely moving his lips. My heart pounded so loudly I swore whoever was out there could hear it. I forced myself to swallow the panic rising in my throat. I didn't want to scare Ethan any more than he already was, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't just afraid, he was expecting this. I turned my phone screen toward him, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button. "Should I call the police?" I mouthed. He hesitated for a second too long, then, almost imperceptibly, he shook his head. I frowned. "Why not?" I mouthed again. Before he could answer, the doorknob rattled. My entire body went stiff. Ethan yanked me back just as a voice, low and rough, muttered from the other side of the door. "You can't ignore me forever, Ethan." I felt his whole body go rigid, the way his breath hitched, the way his eyes darkened. I had never seen him look like this before. Whoever was outside wasn't a stranger. I opened my mouth to whisper something, but before I could, Ethan grabbed my phone and shut off the flashlight. Darkness swallowed us whole. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. Then the voice. "I know you're in there." My pulse slammed against my ribs. Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening like he was bracing for something inevitable. A sickening realization crept over me. Whoever was on the other side of that door, they weren't here by accident. They had come for Ethan, and judging by the fear in his eyes, this wasn't the first time. The silence was suffocating. My pulse thundered in my ears as Ethan stood frozen beside me, his body tense, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't just here by chance, they were here for him. And then the voice came again, low, steady, and laced with something chilling. "Ethan, open the door. You know why I'm here." Ethan inhaled sharply, his entire body trembling. I had never seen him like this before, so vulnerable, so scared. I gripped his wrist. "Ethan," I whispered, "who is that?" His eyes darted to mine, panic flickering across his face. Before he could answer, the door handle twisted violently. The lock held, but just barely. A sickening realization hit me. Whoever this was, they weren't leaving without him. I wasn't about to let that happen. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my phone, turned the screen back on, and dialed 911. But just as I pressed call, Ethan grabbed my hand and shook his head. "What are you doing?" I whispered, desperate. "We need help." His voice was barely audible. "It'll make it worse." Make it worse? My stomach dropped. There was more to this than I understood. Another slam against the door, my breath hitched. Someone had a key to our house. The door creaked open just an inch, revealing a shadowed figure on the other side. I couldn't see his face, but I felt the danger radiating from him. Ethan exhaled shakily, stepping in front of me. "I told you not to come here," the figure chuckled darkly. "And I told you, you don't get to decide that." And then, a gunshot. The sound shattered the night. I screamed, instinctively pulling Ethan back, my heart slamming against my ribs. But when the dust settled, the man was the one on the floor, groaning in pain, and standing in the doorway, holding a gun with steady hands. Was my husband David? I turned to Ethan, my voice barely a whisper. "What the hell is going on?" The room felt frozen in time. The only sound was the heavy rain outside and the man groaning on the floor, clutching his shoulder where David's bullet had hit. My heart pounded as I turned to my husband, still gripping the gun, his face unreadable. "David!" I gasped. "What is going on?" Ethan stood stiffly beside me, his face pale but his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before, relief. David exhaled, lowering the gun. "I got here as fast as I could," he said, his voice tight. "I knew he'd come back for Ethan." I stared at the man on the floor, 1,000 questions racing through my mind. "Who is he?" Ethan finally spoke. "My mother's boyfriend," he murmured. "After she left, he kept trying to find me, said I owed him something, but I never told you because—" His voice broke slightly. "Because I thought he'd never actually come for me." David clenched his jaw. "I got a call earlier from an old friend, said this guy had been asking around about you. I knew then that it was only a matter of time." He looked down at the wounded intruder. "But he won't be bothering you anymore." Just then, the wail of sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the rain-streaked windows. Moments later, officers stormed in, weapons drawn. David raised his hands in surrender, explaining everything to them calmly. Ethan and I stood back, shaken but safe. As they hauled the man to his feet, he shot one last look at Ethan, but this time, Ethan didn't flinch. He held his ground. I reached for his hand and squeezed it. "It's over." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is." That night, as the storm passed and the house finally settled into silence, I realized something. Ethan and I had been strangers forced to share a space. But after everything, we weren't just sharing a room anymore. We were sharing trust. And for the first time since I became his stepmother, I knew he was finally safe. Did you enjoy this story? Let me know in the comments what kind of stories you'd love to hear next. 40.